The day a neon orange survey stake appeared in my vegetable garden was the day the peace in my quiet suburban cul-de-sac was officially declared dead. My name is Elias Thorne, and this is the story of how I took on a tyrannical HOA president and won. 3 years ago, I bought my dream home, a historic farmhouse on the edge of the Oak Ridge subdivision. My property is a bit of an anomaly. It was built almost 40 years before the rest of the neighborhood. When the developers came in, they had to build around my favacre lot. This means I have my own well, my own septic system, and most importantly, a deed that explicitly states I am not, and never will be, part of the Oak Ridge Homeowners Association. I was an island of independence in a sea of beige siding and perfectly manicured lawns. For 2 blissful years, the HOA left me completely alone, which was exactly how I liked it. But then came Brenda Vance. Brenda was freshly elected as the new HOA president, riding a wave of promises about neighborhood revitalization. In her mind, that meant every single blade of grass in a 5-mile radius had to be precisely 2.5 inches tall. She was a retired auditor who seemed to permanently wear a high-visibility vest and carried a clipboard like it was a scepter of power. Our first interaction set the tone for everything that followed. She marched onto my porch, without even knocking, to inform me that my rustic aesthetic was dragging down local property values. I calmly explained that my rustic aesthetic was, in fact, a 100-year-old heritage home, and then I politely asked her to get off my property. She didn't take that well. The orange stake in my garden, right next to my prize-winning heirloom tomatoes, was her opening salvo. When I saw it, I didn't just pull it out. No, that would have been too simple. I went into my office, retrieved my original, ironclad land survey, and walked out to meet the inevitable confrontation. She was already there, standing on the sidewalk with 2 other board members, pointing dramatically at my front porch. I asked her what the stake was for. Brenda gave me this thin, sharp smile that didn't reach her eyes and told me the HOA had discovered an error in the original plat maps. According to her revised reality, the eastern 30 feet of my property, my entire vegetable garden, actually belonged to the Community Green Space Initiative. She then informed me that they would be installing a decorative fence and a walking path right through my tomatoes. As calmly as I could, I explained that my deed predated her entire organization and that my property boundaries were legally set in stone. She just waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly, and said that modern zoning superseded what she called antique paperwork. Then came the ultimatum. I had 48 hours to clear out my garden, or they would assist me. With a bulldozer, I didn't argue. I knew right then that Brenda wasn't someone who responded to reason. She was the type of person who needed to be hit with a legal sledgehammer. That very afternoon, I called my attorney, Sarah. Sarah is a shark in a blazer who specializes in land use law. When I showed her the stake and told her about Brenda's bulldozer threat, she actually laughed out loud. She explained that unless the HOA had a court-ordered eminent domain claim, which, spoiler alert, they did not, they were essentially planning to commit a series of crimes right on my front lawn. So, we didn't just send a cease and desist, we decided to set a trap. I spent the next day installing high-definition, motion-activated cameras, hidden discreetly in the trees overlooking the disputed property line. I also hired a licensed surveyor to come out and do a fresh, certified, boundary marking, leaving no room for interpretation. The following Tuesday, right on schedule, the assistants arrived. I was sitting in my kitchen, enjoying a cup of coffee, when a small bobcat loader and a fencing crew pulled up to the curb. And there was Brenda, in all her glory, directing traffic like she was overseeing the construction of the Great Wall of China. I walked out calmly and handed the foreman a copy of my official survey and Sarah's business card. I informed him that he was currently standing on private property and that if he moved a single inch of my soil, I would be pressing charges for criminal trespass and destruction of property. The foreman looked at my paperwork, then back at Brenda. She started screaming at him to ignore me, calling me delusional and assuring him that the HOA would cover any and all damages. The poor guy made the fatal mistake of believing her. The bobcat's bucket dropped and it took a massive bite out of my garden. My beautiful trellis, my meticulously cared for soil, 3 years of hard work were crushed in seconds. I didn't yell, I didn't lose my cool. I simply pulled out my phone, started recording, and dialed the sheriff's department. When the deputy arrived, Brenda immediately launched into her care explanation of the situation, going on about community aesthetics and my supposed lack of cooperation. But the deputy wasn't having any of it. He looked at my certified survey, he looked at the fresh trench in my garden, and he told the construction crew to shut down their machines immediately. Brenda wasn't arrested that day, but the deputy filed a detailed report that would become the cornerstone of our legal case. By that evening, Sarah had filed an emergency injunction. We weren't just going after the HOA for my ruined garden anymore. We started digging into the entire Green Space Initiative. It turned out Brenda had promised the whole neighborhood a brand new park and walking trail to justify a whopping 20% increase in their monthly dues. The only tiny problem was, the HOA didn't actually own enough land to build it. She had been quietly annexing small, unclaimed-looking strips of land from several neighbors who didn't know any better. But I was the only one with enough land and, frankly, enough spite to stop her dead in her tracks. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded. Brenda was posting frantic updates, painting me as a hostile neighbor who was robbing the children of a place to play. So, I posted my response. I uploaded the crystal-clear video of the bobcat tearing through my garden while Brenda cheered it on. I also posted a scanned copy of my deed, proving to everyone that I wasn't even a member of their HOA. The tide turned almost instantly. People started messaging me, sharing their own horror stories. Neighbors who had been bullied for years over the color of their mailbox or the type of flowers they planted were finally speaking up. One older woman, Mrs. Gable, told me the HOA had forced her to remove a small memorial bench she had placed for her late husband because it was considered unauthorized furniture. It became painfully clear that Brenda wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a tyrant on a power trip. As the legal pressure mounted, Brenda, unbelievably, doubled down. She sent me a bill for $5,000 for obstruction of community improvements. I had it professionally framed and sent a copy to the district attorney's office. The final nail in her coffin came when we discovered that the fencing company Brenda had hired was actually owned by her brother-in-law, and that indemnity she promised them. She was paying it out of the HOA's emergency reserve fund, without a board vote. This had escalated from a simple boundary dispute into a full-blown financial scandal. The fallout was swift. Brenda was removed as president. The board was forced to issue a public apology, and they paid for every last bit of damage to my property, plus a hefty settlement. My garden is thriving again, and the neighborhood is finally free from Brenda's reign of terror. Sometimes, standing your ground isn't just about protecting your property. It's about protecting your peace. The internal rot of the Oak Ridge HOA began to spill out faster than Brenda could patch it. Once Sarah, my lawyer, got discovery rights for our lawsuit, we finally gained access to the HOA's financial records. And let me tell you, it was a complete disaster. It turned out Brenda had been treating the community bank account like her own personal slush fund for so-called beautification projects. Funny enough, these projects almost exclusively involved contractors she had personal ties to. The Green Space project was the crown jewel of her deception. She had already blown $60,000 on planning and materials for a park that was being built on land she did UNT and UNI my land. The real turning point came during a Friday night town hall meeting. Usually, these were sleepy affairs where Brenda would drone on about mulch types. But this time, the community center was packed to the gills. I didn't go as a participant, but as a spectator, with my lawyer by my side. Brenda stood at the podium, trying to keep her composure, but her hands were shaking. She tried to frame our lawsuit as just a minor clerical misunderstanding that would be sorted out soon. That's when Mrs. Gable, a sweet older lady, stood up. She didn't talk about the park. She talked about the $1,200 in fines she paid for unauthorized window treatments. The punchline, they turned out to be the exact same curtains Brenda had hanging in her own guest room. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Then, it was my turn. I didn't make a big speech. I simply walked up and handed a packet of documents to the other board members, the ones Brenda had been deliberately keeping in the dark. That packet contained everything. It had proof of the forged signatures on the green space permit applications. It had the invoices from her brother-in-law's fencing company, which were marked up a staggering 300% above the market rate. The room went completely silent as the vice president, a quiet man named David, read through the papers. He looked up at Brenda, his face pale, and asked the question that sealed her fate. "Brenda, why did you tell us the Thorne property had already been legally ceded?" She didn't have an answer. She tried to storm out, but the trap we had carefully set was closing. Waiting just outside the community center were two investigators from the county auditor's office. They weren't there about the fence. They were there for the fraud, because the HOA receives certain county tax breaks for its green space status. Brenda's falsified documents weren't just unethical, they constituted a felony. Watching her get led away to a charcoal gray sedan, her wrists in handcuffs, was, I have to admit, more satisfying than any harvest I'd ever had from my garden. With Brenda gone, the HOA board collapsed like a house of cards. David and the other members suddenly realized they were legally exposed for failing their fiduciary duties. It wasn't long before they reached out to Sarah to settle. But we didn't just want money, we wanted a permanent, ironclad resolution. The settlement we reached was historic for our area. First, the HOA had to pay for the full restoration of my garden. That included importing organic topsoil and replacing my prized heritage trellises that they had destroyed. They also had to pay a significant settlement for the intentional infliction of emotional distress, not to mention all of my legal fees. But the real kicker, the part I'm most proud of, was the perpetual non-interference easement. It's a legal document, filed directly with the county stating that the Oak Ridge HOA and any of its successor organizations can never again attempt to claim, fine, or even contact my property for any reason. Ever. I am untouchable. But I wasn't done. I knew my neighbors were still hurting from years of Brenda's tyranny. As part of the settlement, I insisted that the HOA undergo a full independent audit, and every single dime collected under Brenda's tenure for non-existent violations had to be refunded to the residents. Of course, with all the money Brenda had embezzled, the HOA didn't have the cash on hand. So, they were forced to sell off the small, actual green space lots they did own to a local land trust. Today, my garden is thriving again. The tomatoes are taller than ever, and where that ugly orange stake once stood, there's now a beautiful, solid stone wall that clearly marks the boundary of my land. The neighborhood is different now, too. Without the constant threat of fines and bogus inspections, people are actually enjoying their homes again. Mrs. Gable put her memorial bench back out on her lawn, and David, the new acting president, stops by occasionally to buy some of my extra honey. He stays on the sidewalk though. He knows better than to cross the line without an invitation. The fence wall taught me a valuable lesson. Some people view a lack of conflict as an invitation to overreach. Brenda saw a quiet man with a garden and assumed I would have the stomach for a real fight. She forgot that the most important part of any structure isn't the fence you build around it, but the foundation it stands on. My foundation was the law, my deed, and a deep-seated refusal to let a bully define my borders. Now, when I sit on my porch in the evenings, the only thing I see at the edge of my property is the sun setting over the trees, and the beautiful golden silence of a battle well and truly won. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to BestWithB12 for more videos.